Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in our The Leadership of the Army of Northern Virginia series, which was conducted at the Virginia Military Institute in October of 1996. In composing this program and picking the people, VMI is such an important place in the Civil War that people who have not been there before need to understand that to people who are Civil War historians, VMI is legendary and will continue to be legendary, even despite all the things that are going on right now, which are turning it toward a different direction that a great many alumni are not happy with. Recently, they removed the statue of Stonewall Jackson from in front of Jackson Arch in Lexington or at VMI. And so what is going on now at Lexington is not what was going on back in 1996. And we attracted a very robust series of speakers who came in and addressed a lot of really interesting aspects of the topic, which was the leadership of the Army in Northern Virginia. Of course, those of you who are close Civil War students understand that Robert E. Lee was not the first commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Joseph E. Johnston was, and Joe Johnston was the second ranking officer in the state of Virginia. And so when Robert E. Lee and Joe Johnston and John Bankhead Magruder and Henry Heth and others offered their resignations from the United States Army and came to Virginia to the governor to offer their services to serve their state, Lee ranked Johnson in the line of the old Army, he being a line colonel, and Johnson having been a brigadier general of staff. He was a quartermaster of the United States. And then this led obviously to a much hyped and significant conflict between President Jefferson Davis and Joseph E. Johnston on seniority. Johnston believed that he ranked Lee because he had been a brigadier general and Lee had only ever been a colonel. And Davis explained that if you want to see and follow one of the great controversies of the war, go do your due diligence on controversies between Joe Johnston and Jefferson Davis. It's fascinating. A neat place to go is the Joseph E. Johnston papers that are in the Earl Gregg Swem archives at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. There are some very, very interesting letters between Davis and Joe Johnston. But our next speaker is Craig Symonds, who at the time had just come out with a biography on Joe Johnston. And of course, with Johnston being very controversial, people felt that he was very reticent to accept offensive warfare or to fight battles. Johnston becomes the antithesis of everything that Robert E. Lee is, Johnston isn't. And so the fact that Craig Symonds, professor of history at the United States Naval Academy, selected him as his subject for a biography earned a lot of good-natured ribbing of Craig by his colleagues, and certainly I gave him a lot of grief as well. Craig and his wife are just a delightful couple. Mary Lou and Craig never go anywhere without each other. And she, of course, accompanied him to this program. And the story that I wanted to tell that I noted in the original go was that as we were walking around, Craig was at the Naval Academy, and they were, of course, and had been co-ed for some time. And the Naval Academy is a branch of the United States Navy where midshipmen are part of the Navy. And so a lot of the things that affected the Navy at that time made the cadet or the midshipman experience at the Naval Academy considerably different. And Mary Lou and Craig lived in and about the Naval Academy campus. And when they came down to Lexington, VMI at the time was still a Southern all-male military school. The issue of integrating women into the Corps would not come for a couple of years yet. And so many of the old traditions at VMI, such as public displays of affection not being permitted, courtesy to ladies, standing when ladies came in the room, tipping hats to ladies, all of this was stuff that was foreign to Mary Lou and Craig. And so as we took our break to go down to have dinner in the officers' mess at the VMI mess hall, Cock Hall, not Cock Hall, I'm too far away from the school, but down at the mess hall in the officers' mess, Mary Lou noted that all the cadets were tipping their hats and said, "Craig, there's another one. Every time I walk by, they're tipping their hats saying, 'Good afternoon, ma'am,' and stuff." And Craig was befuddled. And I looked at him and said, "Craig," I said, "we're Southern gentlemen down here, unlike you heathen Yankees up there in Annapolis." And we all got a big laugh out of it and stuff. And Mary Lou was just absolutely gobsmacked that so many cadets were able to tip their and did tip their hats. Of course, Mary Lou and Craig were just an adorable couple. As you see, Craig's a good-looking guy, and Mary Lou just as good-looking. And so any male cadet certainly appreciated a good-looking woman. So it wasn't very hard to tip your hat to Mary Lou Symonds. But Craig is a very noteworthy historian, and he did a number of programs for us early on before he retired from the Naval Academy. There will be another story I will save for another time with Craig when we're down at Fort Monroe. But I found him to be an extraordinary gentleman, a guy whose company I really enjoyed and whom spoke with immaculate precision and just know him like the back of my hand type of knowledge about his subject. And so please sit back, relax, and enjoy his biographical sketch of the first commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, General Joseph E. Johnston.
Well, thank you, Len, very much, especially for that relatively young comment.
Well, relative to a dinosaur.
Relative to what? Relative to Jack Davis, I guess. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here to talk about Richard McMurray's favorite general. And particularly so coming from the Naval Academy, one military institution with a long tradition of achievement. And what, of course, the Naval Academy and VMI have in common is that we are both co-ed institutions. The title that Len asked me to talk about today, and Len is the one who writes my titles for me, is Virginia's Choice. And it's interesting that should be the title in a conference about leadership in the Army of Northern Virginia. Technically, of course, Johnston never commanded the Army of Northern Virginia. That's a title Robert E. Lee gave that army. Beauregard and Johnston did not call it that. And secondly, although to a certain extent Johnston preceded Lee in command of Confederate forces in Virginia, he was not technically Virginia's choice, as the title suggests. Virginia's choice was in fact Lee. Lee commanded the forces of Virginia, appointment coming from Governor John Letcher. It was, and I think there's a wonderful irony to this, it was Jefferson Davis who chose Joseph E. Johnston. One of the first questions, in fact, that Davis asked after being saddled with the burden of the presidency of the Confederacy, a job that was not his first choice, was, "Where is Joe Johnston?" expecting, anticipating, no doubt hoping that Johnston would become the battlefield commander that, alas, he did not. Indeed, I think it's a window to Johnston's unfortunate touchiness on questions of rank, that when he received a letter several months later on a relatively minor matter that had to do with the administration of the Army from Lee's headquarters, he noted that the printed letterhead, which read "Headquarters of the Virginia Forces," that someone, and presumably a junior officer on Lee's staff, had taken a pen and crossed out the word Virginia, suggesting that this letter was therefore coming from the headquarters of all forces. And Johnston, being Johnston, returned the letter as unacceptable because, as he explained, it is illegal. I am the commander of Confederate forces in Virginia. Lee commands Virginia forces, to be sure. Well, that kind of response, unfortunately, exposes a great deal about Johnston, and not much of it very flattering. So let me suggest a somewhat different title for the talk I'm going to give you this morning. I'll steal it from Steve Woodworth, whom Richard mentioned this morning. He recently published a book called "Davis and Lee at War." The implication of the title, of course, is that this is a book about how Davis and Lee, in cooperation together, orchestrated their war against the Yankees. If, however, I were to suggest to you that my topic today is Davis and Johnston at war, you might reasonably infer quite a different meaning. For while Davis as chief executive and Johnston as his principal field commander, first in Virginia and subsequently in the West, did indeed fight a war against their common enemy, they also expended considerable energy fighting each other. Almost from the beginning, they were literally at war. Now, it has been argued, and indeed it has occasionally been argued by me, that this mutual antagonism between Davis and Johnston was one of the factors, certainly an important factor, in Confederate defeat. And while it is not my purpose here to speculate one way or another about what chance there was, if any, that the Confederacy could win this war, I think it is fair to assert that if the South had any hope at all of overcoming the material, the tangible disadvantages it had against the North in terms of numbers, manpower, and industry, and so forth, it had to have at least two things. That is, commonality of purpose and unity of direction. And the feud between Davis and Johnston helped to assure that it had neither. This is not to say that the South would have won if only somehow Davis and Johnston could have managed to cooperate with each other, but I think it is fair to say that without such unity, it had less chance to overcome the long odds that it faced. Now, participants in that feud, contemporaries, and survivors of the war, and historians ever since, have spent a lot of time and spilled a lot of ink trying to determine whose fault it was that this relationship was as incompatible as it was. Davis's advocates blame Johnston for his personal touchiness, an example of which I've already given you, his political naivete, his unwillingness to cooperate, as Richard pointed out this morning, and his military timidity in the field, all of which are certainly salient characteristics of Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston's advocates, and there are a few, believe it or not, blame Davis and cite the president's own touchiness, his tendency to micromanage, and most of all, perhaps, his tendency to judge commanders by their personal loyalty to him, almost as much, or in some cases perhaps even more so, than their effectiveness in the field. And again, all of these were very real Davis characteristics. How else can you explain the important assignments given to Braxton Bragg, John C. Pemberton, or for that matter, John Bell Hood? The fault, to a certain extent, is on both sides here. And in fact, in some curious ways, the two men were rather alike. Both craved official approval, and both suffered, I think, almost in a physical sense, when it was not forthcoming. Each man felt himself to be martyred to the cause that he served. Both were detail men who wanted to be present in the front lines and oversee even the smallest detail plans that they put together. Now, of the two, I think it is only fair to say that it was Davis who tried harder to bend to necessity. But in the end, their relationship was a tragedy in that the break was perhaps foreordained. As much as any historical event can be said to be foreordained, they were simply incompatible elements. There are a lot of stories about the origin of this misunderstanding, of this feud. There's one that holds that it began while they were both cadets at West Point, where Jefferson Davis was 1 year ahead of both Robert E. Lee and Joseph E. Johnston, class of 1828. Now, according to this story, Johnston and Jefferson Davis quarreled over a girl. Got in a fist fight. I have looked very hard for any evidence to prove this story. I've found none, and I strongly suspect it is a myth invented many years later by one side or the other. My own personal guess would be that Johnston's friends thought it up. And I say that because I suspect it may even have given Johnston a certain amount of secret pleasure to think that others might believe him capable of a romantic rivalry with Jefferson Davis. After all, Davis was a year senior to Johnston at West Point, and at that time in his life, he was also a happy-go-lucky, risk-taking, demerit-earning, regular denizen of Benny Haven's Tavern. Just the kind of dashing and bold, even somehow dangerous individual that might have appealed and been interesting to a young lady of a certain age. Johnston, by contrast, was then, as later in life, an upright and uptight do-gooder who earned almost no demerits in 4 years and whose nickname at West Point was the Colonel, a title which in those days probably suggested someone who was fussy and conservative in his personal habits. It is hard to imagine that a young lady who was attracted to one of these men would find the other the least bit interesting. Note that at this age, the two men were very different from one another. I just got through saying a minute ago how similar they were. While Johnston's personality remained largely unchanged through his middle years, Davis underwent a transforming experience in the mid-1830s. Years after his graduation from West Point, he met, wooed, and married Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of his commanding officer and, of course, future President of the United States. And on their honeymoon, both Davis and his pretty young bride contracted malaria. And while Jeff Davis survived, Sarah did not. She died in September, and her widowed husband was somehow never quite the same man. The devil-may-care joie de vivre was gone, and it was replaced by the dour and largely humorless statesman that we remember today as Jefferson Davis. Davis nearly gave up on being happy in those dark days. He nearly gave up on life, I suspect. For another 7 years, he would, as a later generation would call it, dropped out, spending most of his time managing a plantation given him by his brother Joseph at Davis Bend, a few miles south of Vicksburg. It was Joseph who arranged the meeting at Christmas time in 1843 with then 17-year-old Verena Howell. And 2 years later, the 41-year-old widower married the 19-year-old Verena. I mentioned that age difference to my class the other day when I was talking about Jefferson Davis in my course on the Civil War, and all my teenage and 20-something students thought that was just about the right age differential. That event, plus the outbreak of the Mexican War a few years later, re-energized Davis and brought him back into national prominence. Joe Johnston, meanwhile, had been laboring away in the Army, seeking opportunity for advancement and promotion any place that he could find it. Eagerness for promotion may seem a bit indecorous, perhaps more so now than it was in the 19th century, but it was a near universal preoccupation with career officers. We're so used to thinking of accelerated promotions in wartime, those of us who read about the Civil War, that we have to remind ourselves that prior to the Civil War, you waited a long time between promotions in the old Army. For Johnston, as well as for Davis, the war with Mexico brought that opportunity. Both men took advantage of it. Davis had long since left the Army, but as a volunteer colonel, of the Mississippi Rifles. He won plaudits for the performance of his regiment at Buena Vista, and Johnston, for his part, won plaudits for leading a battalion of voltigeurs, essentially fancy militia, that successfully stormed the Mexican citadel of Chapultepec. They both emerged from this war as heroes. Davis parlayed that newfound notoriety into a political career. Johnston found the promotion he had long sought within the Army. Johnston won 2 brevets during the Mexican War. Brevet, as most of you probably know, is a temporary promotion granted in wartime for exemplary conduct, and universally they are for wartime service only, that once the war comes to an end, then you revert to your substantive rank, the rank generally that you went into the war carrying. This is why, for example, Custer died as a lieutenant colonel at the Little Bighorn, even though he had been a major general many years before in the Civil War, brevets being removed. After the Mexican War, however, Congress was in such an expansive mood, they declared that all officers earning brevets during the war would be allowed to keep those brevet promotions in the regular Army. Well, this is great news for Joe Johnston. He had entered the war as a captain, been promoted to major almost immediately. Then he won 2 brevets, to lieutenant colonel and to colonel, that raised him, as far as he saw it, to the rank of full bird colonel. Or at least that's the way he had it figured out. In the 1850s, he was astonished to learn that the new Secretary of War, who was, of course, Jefferson Davis, ruled that since Johnston had started the war as a captain and had won 2 brevets, that made him a lieutenant colonel, not a colonel. And despite frequent protest, Johnston could not dissuade Davis from that interpretation of the statute. This episode marked the first open disagreement between the 2 men. Despite Davis's official decision on the question, Johnston would not let it go. He all but badgered the Secretary's office with appeals for reconsideration. And in hindsight, looking back on this event, it's easy to see this as perhaps the first straw in the wind of the coming storm. But despite Johnston's embarrassing determination on this issue, there is no evidence that this marked the beginning of an ongoing dispute between the 2 men. No long-term hostility resulted. When the Civil War broke out in the spring of 1861, Johnston was a brigadier general in the U.S. Army. He had finally gotten his promotion to colonel, due largely to the influence of Buchanan's Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, who was a distant cousin of Johnston's by marriage. And soon afterward, he was promoted again by virtue of his appointment as Quartermaster General of the U.S. Army, a staff rank which carried with it an automatic promotion to the rank of Brigadier General. For his part, Davis had long since left the War Office and taken a seat in the United States Senate. Both Davis and Johnston plighted themselves to the Confederacy. Davis in an emotional and challenging speech on the floor of the Senate, Johnston in a tearful resignation in the offices of the War Department. Now, as it turned out, Len mentioned in the introduction, or actually this morning when he was introducing the whole session, that Johnston was the only general officer in the United States Army to resign his commission and fight for the Confederacy. Davis made Johnston a full general and placed him in command of the Army gathering at Harper's Ferry. The first appointment was to Brigadier General, and then after he was posted to Harper's Ferry, made it clear in subsequent correspondence that his rank was in fact that of a full general. But this, after all, is a Confederate Army appointment, not necessarily commander of the Virginia forces, which was Lee's assignment. It was from Harper's Ferry that Johnston brought his small army of about 9,000 men east, mostly by rail, to join Beauregard at Manassas Junction, almost literally in the nick of time, to swing the balance of forces toward the south and help win the Battle of Bull Run/Manassas. Johnston was the senior officer present in that battle. But because he was newly arrived to the field, because most of the troops who engaged in this fight were Beauregard's, he left it to Beauregard and his staff to plan that battle. Alas, and rather typically for Beauregard, The plan was a mishmash of unlikely assumptions, grandiose assertions, and unfortunately vague orders. The plan called for an attack on the enemy, and most of the independent brigades that made up the rebel army were ordered merely to hold themselves in readiness to respond to circumstances. Though as senior officer on the field, Johnston had authority to overrule these orders, there was no time to create new ones. He was first shown them at 4 o'clock in the morning on the day of the battle, and he therefore endorsed the orders with his signature and directed that they be delivered to the brigade commanders. Well, the Confederate attack in those orders never took place. Indeed, the orders, most of them at least, were never delivered. The attack of the Federal Army across Sudley Springs Ford and up onto Henry House Hill made those plans moot in any case. To give him credit, it was Johnston who recognized that the attack on the Confederate left was the main Federal effort and who directed reinforcements onto Henry House Hill. Once there, however, it was Beauregard who assumed tactical command at the fighting front, while Johnston returned to the rear to forward reinforcements, which after all is probably the proper position for the Army commander. But as a result of that, the popular credit for the subsequent victory belonged, in the public mind at least, not to Johnston, who officially, I suppose, commanded the Army, but to Beauregard, who had fought on Henry House Hill. Still, Manassas enhanced Johnston's stature as well as Beauregard's, and despite some disagreement about the failure to pursue the fleeing Yankees, his relationship with Davis at that point seemed to be fairly well established on firm ground. The summer after Bull Run, most of August, passed relatively quietly. Johnston cautiously moved the army he now commanded northward toward Fairfax, and then drew back again to Centerville, where he erected a defensive position. He declined to undertake a general offensive in the late summer of '61 on the grounds that his forces were inadequate to the task. Davis did not press him, and their correspondence retained a cordial, even a friendly tone. Then in the fall, however, Davis announced the names in order of rank of the 5 men who would be confirmed as full generals in the Confederate Army. Johnston was among them, to be sure, but he was listed 4th, behind Samuel Cooper, who was in effect chief of staff and never held an active field command, but who had seniority, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. Albert Sidney Johnston, whom Jefferson Davis suspected was probably the greatest potential commander of Confederate forces, and Robert E. Lee, Johnston's classmate. Lee and Johnston being the only 2 Virginians to graduate together in the class of 1829. It is fairly evident to me, I think, that Davis made this ranking based on the order of their graduation from West Point. Cooper, 1815, Sidney Johnston, 1827, and Lee and Johnston in the same class, but Lee graduated 2nd, Johnston 13th, so the seniority issue remains the same. But Johnston believed that he'd been ill-treated. He pointed out that an act of the Confederate Congress declared that officers in the rebel army would hold the same rank relative to their peers that they had held in the old army, the reference here being, of course, to the United States Army. Since Johnston, by virtue of his appointment as Brigadier General, had been senior to Cooper, Lee, and Sidney Johnston in the U.S. Army, he believed he should be ranked above them now. To move him from 1st to 4th was, in effect, in Johnston's mind, a demotion, a slap in the face. He wrote a long, rambling, self-justifying, almost self-pitying letter to Davis to complain about it. Actually, he wrote the letter out in longhand and put it in his desk drawer and let it sit there overnight. A very wise move. Should have waited a few more days. But the next day, he pulled it out, read it through, and decided, by God, that's exactly right, I'm going to send it, and he did. Davis took that letter with him to a cabinet meeting. Davis was prone to hold these rather extended cabinet meetings. And he read it aloud, the whole letter, 15 pages, to demonstrate Johnston's insubordination. His reply, which was very brief, was cool and official. That foolish and childish letter from Johnston marked the real beginning of the feud between the 2 men that would so devastate Confederate hopes, not only in the East, but also in the real theater of war. Even now, however, I suspect that that breach was still healable. Johnston did not resign, for all his pique. Davis did not seek to replace him. But there was never again the full and confident exchange of ideas that is the ideal relationship between the head of state and the commander of the army in the field. In addition to their personal difficulties, Davis and Johnston did have real differences on the question of Confederate strategy. At the risk of oversimplifying these views, I will note only that in general, Davis believed in defending the Confederacy everywhere that it was physically possible to do so. This view was dictated by both military and political circumstances. First of all, a strategy of an extended defense gave nothing away to the Yankees, compelled them to occupy only what they could take by force. And second, of course, it was impolitic for the leader of a confederated government willingly to give up part of one state in order to defend another. It doesn't play well in the state being surrendered. Could he, for example, tell the governor of North Carolina that he must send his troops into Virginia to defend Richmond while Union Navy and Army forces occupied Hatteras Inlet, Roanoke Island, and threatened New Bern? Davis therefore sought to defend as much Confederate territory as it was practical to defend, spreading out the Confederacy's manpower resources as necessary. Johnston had a completely different view. Of course, he was under no obligation, as he saw it, to take political considerations in mind. So he could dismiss out of hand Davis's sensitivity for the concerns of nervous governors. The military circumstances, he argued, were self-evident. It was up to the executive to explain the realities of those military circumstances to those governors. Johnston's own strategic views were based on what he perceived as these realities. Because the North had a 5-to-1 manpower and material advantage, the Confederacy simply could not spread out its defenses and leave it to this superior enemy to choose the time and place for its attack. Instead, he argued, the South must concentrate its forces into 1 or 2 large field armies and seek decisive battle at a place of its own choosing. If that meant the temporary abandonment of one part or another of the Confederacy, so be it. In the long run, military victory in the field would restore what had been temporarily abandoned. It may be a bit surprising, perhaps, to hear such high-risk, offensive-minded stuff coming from the mind of Joseph E. Johnston. After all, there are a few cases on record of his actually undertaking an offensive. But these were the views he argued on Jefferson Davis in their February and March meetings in 1862, prior to the Battle of Seven Pines. It is worth noting that Johnston's views on this particular issue were similar to those of Robert E. Lee. But Lee, unlike Johnston, had the delicacy and tact to sell them effectively to Davis and make the Confederate president believe that to a certain extent they were his own, whereas Johnston tended merely to assert his views and assume that the evident correctness of those views would carry the day. These divergent views became crucial when McClellan brought his army to the peninsula and disembarked it at Fort Monroe. Johnston was still in command of the Confederacy's principal army in Virginia. The 3 men whom Davis had ranked above him, that is Samuel Cooper, who was then acting effectively as chief of staff in Richmond, had a desk job. Sidney Johnston, of course, was preparing at that time to confront Sherman and Grant at Shiloh, where he would lose his life. Robert E. Lee, Johnston's classmate, rival, was Davis's military advisor. Once it became evident, therefore, that the federal reinforcement of the garrison at Fort Monroe was more than routine and that this was a major effort aimed at the capture of Richmond, Davis and his generals had to determine how to respond. Davis wanted to leave Johnston's army where it was on the south bank of the Rappahannock River, while other forces under John B. Magruder kept an eye on McClellan's growing army at Fort Monroe. President therefore ordered Johnston to send reinforcements from his army on the Rappahannock down to Magruder on the Virginia Peninsula. Johnston obeyed those orders, but with serious misgivings. He saw this as the worst possible strategic response. His army on the Rappahannock slowly waned from 40,000 down to 23,000, while Magruder's army on the peninsula grew from 10,000 to over 30,000. Johnston believed that these dispositions threw away the advantage of interior lines. Instead of using that advantage to concentrate Confederate forces against first one and then the other of the Union armies, Davis was apparently intending to split Confederate forces between the two and contest the field both places at once. As Johnston saw it, the result would be that neither Confederate army would be strong enough to be assured of success in the field. He argued that all Confederate forces should be concentrated at either one place or the other. In fact, all Confederate forces, not only in the Virginia theater, but from elsewhere in the East. If part of northern Virginia had to be surrendered to defeat the enemy gathering now on the Virginia Peninsula, wouldn't it be logical as well, he argued, to bring forces from the Carolinas? The Carolina coast could be surrendered temporarily, for troops from the Georgia coast as well. All could be brought to Richmond to gather one large field army to engage in and win decisive battle. If Richmond fell, he argued, holding the Rappahannock line, defending New Bern, North Carolina, these things would hardly matter. In the first week of April, McClellan's army sallied from Fort Monroe and began a cautious advance. Of course, it's a cautious advance, it's McClellan. Up the peninsula. It seemed sure that this was now the decisive engagement of the war. Davis wired Johnston to come personally to Richmond to discuss the crisis. In his first inspection of the defensive lines that Magruder had erected on the peninsula, Johnston was unimpressed. The works, he said, are too lengthy to be effectively defended, but more importantly, they could be turned on either flank by Union naval forces operating either on the York or the James Rivers. He argued that Magruder's force should be pulled back from those lines, that reinforcements be brought at once from Georgia, from the Carolinas, and that a massive Confederate army under his own command should be assembled outside Richmond. It would strike, Johnston asserted, once McClellan had advanced beyond the range of the protective gunboats. Here was a high-risk strategy indeed. In the name of the concentration of force, Johnston was willing to give up not only the line of the Rappahannock and the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas, but also Norfolk and its Navy Yard. Davis was at least skeptical of these recommendations. And he was supported both by the War Secretary at the time, George Randolph, and by his military advisor, Robert E. Lee. Lee thought the peninsula was a fine place for the Confederacy to make a stand. It offered a narrow front which would minimize the Union superiority in numbers. Again, Johnston accepted this decision, albeit reluctantly, and went personally to command that army at Yorktown. But he had no serious intention of fighting it out with McClellan's army on the Yorktown line. As it turned out, he didn't have to. If the earthworks that Magruder had prepared there had not impressed Johnston, they certainly impressed McClellan, who decided they were so formidable he had no option now but to embark on a regular siege using virtually the same tactics that had been put together by Vauban in the 17th century to capture castles and fortified cities. Johnston harassed these efforts, but the Union advance was inexorable and, as a result, he believed at least, inevitable. On May 3rd, he ordered a quiet midnight evacuation. Now, historians since then, even those who tend to be skeptical of Johnston as a fighting general, have tended to applaud his timely withdrawal from the Yorktown line. Had he stayed even another day, some speculate, it is likely that McClellan would have had his heavy field artillery in position to force him to stay in those lines against his will. By holding the line at Yorktown, Johnston had bought the Confederacy a month. Of course, holding that line had not been his idea in the first place. And what was even worse for the Davis-Johnston relationship was that Davis found out about Johnston's withdrawal from the Yorktown line only the day before it was to take place. In other words, Johnston had not kept Davis informed of his plans. The Confederate president immediately wired Johnston, telling him, "Your announcement that you will withdraw tomorrow takes us by surprise." Applied criticism, obviously. Johnston wired back a defensive response. "I determined to retire because we can do nothing here. We must lose. By delay, we may ensure the loss of Richmond too." In other words, I got out just in time. Davis was skeptical of the immediacy of the need to fall back, but short of accusing his army commander of, at the very least, bad judgment, he would just have to live with it. Which, of course, brings to light, once again, the single greatest failing in the Davis-Johnston relationship, the lack of full and free communication. This is mostly Johnston's fault, of course. He made little serious effort to cultivate the president's support, and it was deliberate on his part. It was not that Johnston wanted a confrontational relationship with Jefferson Davis, but he believed that sending daily informational letters and repeated solicitous invitations for Davis to make suggestions, that this kind of behavior was entirely inappropriate for a commander in the field. He wrote later to an ally, "I did not consult the president because it seemed to me that to do so would be to transfer my responsibilities to his shoulders. I could not consult him without adopting the course he might advise, so that to ask his advice would have been, in my opinion, to ask him to command for me." This was probably more than simple justification. Johnston really believed that it was a field officer's responsibility to accept his duty, not to ask questions, not to seek advice, but to shoulder that burden himself. Of course, that does not explain why he did not at least keep the president better informed than he did. He conceived it to be the job of a field general to plan, fight, and win battles, and then to inform the head of state afterward. Alas, Johnston did not win many battles either. When he finally did attack McClellan at 7 Pines, he achieved only modest results, pushing McClellan back about 3.5, 4 miles, but failing to inflict the kind of defeat that would compel a federal retirement. Worse yet, he once again failed to keep Davis informed. 7 Pines was a personal nightmare for Joseph E. Johnston. He claimed afterward and for the rest of his life that the battle was an unappreciated Confederate victory. It was his first experience in commanding so large an army. The records are in dispute, but it appears likely that he had upward of 70,000 men available to hurl at McClellan. Moreover, McClellan had provided him with a golden opportunity by dividing his own forces straddling the rain-swollen banks of the Chickahominy River. Johnston's plan was to hit the smaller element of this divided army and overwhelm it with the larger part of his own. Alas, his own inexperience, the unwieldy size and organization of his army, and perhaps most of all the cupidity of James Longstreet, made a mockery of those plans. Johnston hoped to use the road network outside Richmond to bring together a total of 21 brigades against an isolated Union corps. The plan was relatively straightforward, but it required him to bring together the commands of Huger, Daniel Harvey Hill, and Longstreet in converging columns on different roads and have them all arrive at the same time in more or less the same place. It all came apart almost immediately. Huger was delayed, and Longstreet, for reasons no one has ever been able to explain convincingly, took the wrong road. As a result of that, his columns got confused with those of D.H. Hill. They had a big argument about who was senior, who got to go first across the bridge. At Gillies Creek, instead of splashing through the waist-deep water, the lead brigade conducted a makeshift bridge of a plank to a wagon and then a plank down the other side, and the whole force tiptoed across it single file, wasting several hours. Johnston, all this time, was at his headquarters, presumably where the Army commander belongs, awaiting reports from the front. Lee arrived, representing Davis, to ask how things went. In truth, Johnston had no clue. But then in the middle of the afternoon, he got a report that seemed to clarify the picture for him almost at once. An aide returned with a message from Longstreet, who claimed that he had the enemy on the run, bit of an exaggeration, but that he needed reinforcements to keep the drive going. As Johnston pictured it in his mind, he could see Longstreet and Hill facing east, pushing the enemy back. All Johnston needed to do then was bring his reserves in on the Federal right, and the rout would ensue. At once, he left the headquarters, mounted up, and prepared to go to the front. At last, he had something that he could do. And at just that moment, Jefferson Davis rode up to Johnston's headquarters. What was Johnston to do? He felt he did not have the time to stop and give the president a lengthy report on what was happening and who was where and what was going on. He had things to do. He had to go. Time was pressing. He pretended not to see him and rode off. But of course, Davis saw him go and drew his own conclusions. Well, Johnston arrived at the front, found things vastly different from what he had imagined, in fact, different from what Longstreet had reported. Trying to push in the Federal right wing, he exposed himself to both rifle and artillery fire, and even as his troops returned back, he fell badly wounded. While being carried to the rear, his stretcher bearers encountered Jefferson Davis, himself riding to the sound of the guns. All their differences were immediately forgotten in that moment of crisis. Davis was off his horse, kneeling by the side of the stretcher. "How are you? Anything I can do? Are you badly hurt?" Johnston shook his head and was carried away to the rear. Now Davis faced an even more serious problem than an uncooperative Army commander. No Army commander. Officially, the Army fell to Major General Gustavus Woodson Smith, an indifferent officer at best, who had joined the Confederate cause rather late and whose loyalty was under serious suspicion by many. In the long run, Smith would not do as a replacement for Johnston. That was evident. But who else was there? Davis, of course, turned to his military advisor, then riding alongside, and asked Robert E. Lee if he would take over command duties. And like that now forgotten player, and somebody in this audience can probably name him for me, that player who had to leave the lineup of the Yankees, that is the baseball team, not the Army, to be replaced by Lou Gehrig, Johnston would never get back his starting position. And the rest, as they say, is history. Lee initiated the series of battles known as the 7 Days that drove McClellan back from the gates of Richmond down to the banks of the James River and ensured him the permanent command of the Army. Historians have often quoted the line from Johnston that the bullet which struck him down at Seven Pines was actually an artillery shell that did him the most harm. He did have a bullet wound as well, but it was the language in his chest that actually threw him from his horse. But Johnston had a pretty good ear for images and useful phrases. That the bullet which struck him down at Seven Pines was the best shot ever fired for the Confederacy because it brought Lee to command. Now this might be construed to suggest that Johnston was being magnanimous and self-effacing, recognizing Lee's superiority as a commander. But the rest of the passage is revealing. Johnston went on to say that Lee's command was successful because he had the confidence of the administration. In other words, what Johnston meant was that Lee's ascension to command was valuable to the Confederacy, not necessarily because Lee was a better Army commander than Johnston, but because he could handle Davis. And Johnston, obviously, could not. Ironically, the next 6 months, the period of time Johnston was laid up convalescing from his wounds in Richmond, proved to be the most decisive in wrecking the personal relationship between Jefferson Davis and Joseph E. Johnston, beyond the point of recovery. What doomed that relationship was politics. Only days after the battle at Seven Pines, Johnston received a visit from Texas Senator Louis T. Wigfall, his wife Charlotte. Johnston had known Wigfall only briefly, for a matter of days, commanded a brigade in Johnston's army. Then he had resigned that position to take a seat in the Confederate Senate. Now Wigfall offered the hospitality of his home in Richmond as a place where Johnston could recuperate from his wounds. Johnston gratefully accepted. It was a fateful decision on his part. For Wigfall soon emerged as one of Davis's most persistent political opponents. Over the next several months, Johnston allowed himself to become associated with those political opponents. As the relationship between Johnston and Wigfall strengthened, that of Johnston and Davis grew worse. Others took sides and egged on the principals in this feud for purposes of their own. Johnston accepted solace, commiseration, promises of support from Wigfall and from others of Davis's foes in the Confederate Congress. And in time he became a cat's paw for their own schemes to undermine the credibility of the Confederate president. They used Johnston's name and his reputation, which was still very high in the general public, to assail Davis. Now, Johnston himself never became an active player in this political game. If someone had suggested to him that he was playing politics, he would have been offended. Nonsense. It is not the business of professional officers to become involved in political questions. All he did, after all, was accept the support of high-ranking members of the government who told him he was being ill-treated. What was he to do? Deny it? Johnston was being naive here, but at the same time more than a little bit self-deceptive. As you can imagine, the effect of Johnston's name being invoked on the floor of the Confederate Congress as evidence of the president's incompetence did little to endear him to Jefferson Davis. In any event, by the time Johnston had recovered from his wounds, Lee's record of successes in the field was such that even Johnston appreciated there was no chance that he could successfully move back into command of the army in Virginia. Instead, Davis sent him west. There he held a rather curious command as the coordinator of two field armies, Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee and John C. Pemberton's Army of Mississippi. Though he commanded neither army directly, he was, the way Davis envisioned the responsibility, supposed to shuttle reinforcements back and forth between these two armies as need required. It never quite worked out the way Davis imagined that it would. In fact, it never really worked at all. And one hardly wonders at this in hindsight. I don't know if anyone here can think of two men with fewer qualifications for command than Braxton Bragg and John C. Pemberton. Richard might suggest maybe Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, of course, there were the vast distances to be covered. Richard mentioned this morning the huge expanse of the Western Theater as contrasted to the Eastern Theater, where shuttling armies back and forth over a rickety rail system looked easier on a map than in fact turned out to be in real life. Though Davis believed that Johnston should have been able to shuttle troops back and forth, geography and what Clausewitz would call friction made that impractical, if not impossible. The fall of Vicksburg in 1863 put the final unhappy punctuation mark on the end of this command experiment, and as far as Davis was concerned, on Johnston as well. Johnston had never managed to assemble a force strong enough to lift Grant's siege of Vicksburg, and after that, Davis all but gave up on it. When Josiah Gorgas remarked to Davis that Pemberton's army in Vicksburg had had to surrender for want of provisions, Davis spat back in a famous line, "Yes, from want of provisions inside and a general outside who wouldn't fight." Davis was determined never to give Johnston an important command again. Of course, Johnston's political friends in Richmond, who were also, and not coincidentally, Davis's political foes, complained about this constantly. But to Davis, this was all the more reason to keep Johnston at arm's length. But Davis, in the end, could not resist this public and political pressure to reinstate Johnston. After the debacle of Missionary Ridge in November of 1863, Davis was again compelled to appoint Johnston to an army command, to command the Army of Tennessee. When the spring campaign began in May of 1864, the only two effective field armies of the Confederacy were those commanded by the West Point classmates, Robert E. Lee in Virginia and Joseph E. Johnston in North Georgia. While Grant and Lee slugged it out in Virginia, in the wilderness, Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, Davis watched with more alarm than surprise as Johnston fell back before Sherman's advance, giving up mile after mile of Georgia territory to the invader, and making what seemed to Davis, at least, no serious attempt to stop him. The historiographical argument about whether this was Johnston's fault, which I suppose we can get into later, is less important than the fact that Davis certainly believed it to be his fault. With Braxton Bragg whispering poisonous innuendos about Johnston in Davis's ear, and John Bell Hood writing secret self-promotional letters from the front, the intrigue in the Army of Tennessee would have made members of the Roman Senate blush. By July, Davis had seen and heard enough. He ordered Johnston dismissed and replaced him with Hood. Hood then led that army into a series of fierce and largely unsuccessful battles around Atlanta, and then into a quixotic invasion of Tennessee that led to its virtual destruction. Johnston went into retirement. But there is an epilogue. All through the winter of 1864-65, as Hood led the Army of Tennessee to its destruction and Lee survived a bitter and wasting siege at Richmond, Johnston lived in relative comfort in Columbia, South Carolina. The Southern public, staring defeat in the face, looked for a miracle, a savior. In January of 1865, the Confederate Congress passed a bill naming Robert E. Lee by name the commander-in-chief of all Confederate armies, thus effectively stripping that power from Davis. At the same time, the Congress recommended, but did not require, the assignment of General Joseph E. Johnston to command the Army of Tennessee. Johnston's political friends at work again. Davis was humiliated, but also defiant. He sat down and compiled a 15-page indictment of Johnston for the purpose of explaining to the Confederate Congress why he could not, under any circumstances, again give Johnston the command of a Confederate army. At different times during the war, Davis wrote, I have given to General Johnston 3 very important commands, and in each case, experience has revealed defects which unfit him for the conduct of a campaign. Davis asserted that Johnston had failed to hold Harper's Ferry in Virginia during his first command. He had given up Centerville without a fight. He had retreated from Yorktown and Dalton, and for more than 2 months had given way before Sherman's army in Georgia without once making a serious effort to halt that destructive campaign. Item by item, in Davis's characteristic, detailed, and precise way, he compiled a portrait of a man so hopelessly incompetent that he should never again be entrusted with important military responsibility. I thought Richard would stand up and applaud when I read that. My opinion of General Johnston's unfitness for command has ripened slowly into a conviction so settled that it would be impossible for me again to feel confidence in him as the commander of an army in the field. But in the end, he did it anyway. It was Lee who convinced him that if nothing else, Johnston's restoration to command would improve morale in the ranks in that dark and bitter winter, and would encourage veterans to return to the colors. The news of his reinstatement brought Sherman no joy. Given the long history of his relationship with Davis, he was convinced that the President had returned him to command only so that he would bear the responsibility of having to make the final surrender. That humiliation would belong to him. He wrote to a friend in Richmond that it was too late in the game to expect him to accomplish anything with the weak and scattered forces available. When he got Lee's orders to concentrate your forces and drive back Sherman, he replied, these troops form an army too weak to cope with Sherman. The next day he chanced to run into Mary Chestnut, who was also living nearby, who who wrote in her diary that night that Johnston professed to be very angry to be ordered to take command again. And apparently that anger was more than just feigned, for his wife Lydia wrote privately to a close friend that her husband was in the very devil of a bad humor because of his conviction that he was only put back to be the one to surrender. On 3 days in mid-March 1865, Joseph E. Johnston fought his last battle. It was also the last major battle of the Civil War, Bentonville, North Carolina. It's easy to see how for Joe Johnston, this was an opportunity for redemption. A victory here would redeem his own reputation as a general who would not fight. It would redeem the honor of the Army of Tennessee, slandered, as he saw it, by Hood, as timorous, as a justification for Hood's own failures in Tennessee. It is easy to imagine that Johnston saw the Battle of Bentonville as a chance to show them. If Bentonville were not a Confederate victory, it was at least a check to Sherman's hitherto unopposed advance through the Carolinas, and Johnston was pleased by that. Sherman had been punished. He would have to be more careful. Then, too, he believed that his soldiers had proven Hood's criticism to be a slander. Pointedly, he wired to Lee, "Troops of Tennessee Army have fully disproved slanders that have been published against them." But the moment didn't last. Only days afterward, news arrived that Lee had been forced from Richmond and that the government had been compelled to flee the city. Davis ordered Johnston to report to him at Greensboro on the 12th of April. Note the date. When Johnston dutifully arrived, he heard the news that Lee had surrendered. As far as he was concerned, that meant the war was over. There was nothing but a longer casualty list that could now be gained from prolonging the war for even another day. When he reported to Davis, however, the president was eager to talk about ways to continue that war. Johnston was appalled. Evidently, Davis sensed it, for he stopped almost in mid-sentence and pointedly asked Johnston for his views. It was a moment of awkward silence as these two personal and political enemies regarded one another. And Johnston spoke. "My views, sir," he began, "are that our people are tired of this war, feel themselves whipped, and will not fight." Davis looked down and worried a small piece of paper in his hands, folding it, unfolding it back and forth. Finally, Johnston continued, "Our country is overrun, its military resources greatly diminished, while the enemy's military power and resources were never greater and may be increased to any extent desired. My men are daily deserting in large numbers, stealing my artillery teams to aid in their escape. Since Lee's surrender, they regard the war as at an end." Still, Davis didn't look up. He asked Beauregard for his thoughts, and that officer replied, "I concur in everything that General Johnston has just said." Another long silence. Finally, Davis asked Johnston what he proposed to do. At that point, Johnston suggested that he send a note through the lines to General Sherman and request an armistice. Davis didn't want to do it. "Well, sir," he said, "you may adopt this course, though I confess I am not sanguine as to ultimate results." Johnston took that as permission to act. He met Sherman at the Bennett House near Durham Station and surrendered his army. Davis never forgave him. Their feud extended into the post-war years as each man wrote memoirs critical of the other. Who was right, who was wrong? In the end, they both were. Thank you. Okay.
Questions?
I should get behind this question. Yes.
In the beginning, you mentioned when Judge Davis demoted the colonel to lieutenant colonel. To me, what was his motivation for even bothering?
For Davis doing so?
Yeah.
The way Davis saw it, Johnston entered that war as a captain. He had won 2 brevets, and therefore those 2 brevets had raised him from captain to major and major to lieutenant colonel. He recognized both those brevets and granted him his lieutenant colonelcy, which is the same rank, by the way, that Robert E. Lee came out of that war with, lieutenant colonel. Johnston's argument was, no, the first one, the promotion from captain to major, that wasn't a brevet. That was a regular promotion. That shouldn't count against me. So I should start the war as a major, and my 2 brevets should be to lieutenant colonel and colonel. It's a matter of interpretation. Davis's position was perfectly consistent, and he treated every other officer the same way. But Johnston, who, being eager for promotion, as every other officer of that age was also, believed that the interpretation was unfair. That's a legitimate discussion the 2 of them might have had. What was unfortunate in Johnston's behavior under these circumstances is that, having been told no, he wouldn't let go of it. He badgered Davis. He wrote him a series of letters, and then when Davis didn't seem to be forthcoming, he wrote others who were sympathetic to his position and urged them to write to Davis saying, hey, Joseph E. Johnston should be a full colonel, not a lieutenant colonel. So it was the ill wisdom of Johnston's consistent and unfortunate behavior in badgering Davis for that promotion that I think was indelicate about the whole relationship. Either man could make a good case that his interpretation of the statute was accurate. And a professional officer's responsibility probably ought to have been, sir, let me explain the positions why I believe your interpretation was incorrect. If the answer comes back no, your response is, yes, sir. That wasn't Johnston's response. Yes?
Could you advocate Jefferson Davis's position and defend what Johnston could have done there during Sherman's attack there
In North Georgia.
What would you expect?
Well, the argument here is, first of all, the argument begins because Davis is not convinced, even at the moment he appoints Johnston to that command, that he's made a decision that is in the best interest of the Confederacy. He's been kind of coerced into it. There's really nobody else that's available to him. I mean, Beauregard was a possibility, but Beauregard was worse than Johnston, unquestionably. Clearly, he even, broached the idea to Lee. We were talking earlier this morning about, was there any discussion about Lee going to the West? Well, Davis toyed with the idea and brought it up to Lee in conversations. Lee made it clear he didn't want to do that. Eventually, later on, of course, he sends James Longstreet. But the difficulty is that Davis really doesn't have much choice. Johnston is not his first choice or even his second choice. So there's that distrust to begin with. Then during the winter of 63-64, Bragg, who had been Johnston's predecessor in that army, suggested to Davis that this is a fine time for the Army of Tennessee to initiate an offensive, to regain some of that lost territory. And Johnston never moves from North Georgia. His explanations may in fact be accurate. I don't have enough men. There's insufficient forage for the horses in the middle of winter. The route that Bragg suggests, which is through eastern Tennessee and the mountainous region, the roads are bad, there's snow covering the forage. It would take more mules to carry the forage for the horses than he had in his army, and so on and so on. But all of this seemed to Davis to be very familiar territory. Here are the reasons why I can't do what you want. And combined with the fact that Johnston never went out of his way to explain that in sufficient detail, that's the second nail in the coffin, that he doesn't advance over the winter. Then when the spring weather comes and mobility is restored to the two armies, Johnston is forever reacting to Sherman's initiatives. And what the strategy that he eventually develops is, look, what we need to do is draw Sherman within Georgia so his lines of supplies are extended, and then strike at those lines of supplies with cavalry sent from Mississippi. And Davis' response is, well, you have cavalry. Why can't you send cavalry? And Johnston said, well, I need all my cavalry to keep track of what Sherman's doing and to protect my own flanks as I maneuver in North Georgia. And Davis found this, again, more excuse-making. If it is possible for cavalry that is distant, he writes to a friend, why is it not possible for cavalry that is near? The argument that I make is that it is conceivable that a strategy, and Richard may want to argue against this, but it is conceivable that a strategy such as the one Johnston presented finally in June of 1864 might have been effective. But Davis is not going to approve that strategy because he's lost all faith in Joseph E. Johnston. This is where the tragedy comes in. If you have a genuinely cooperative relationship with field commander and commander-in-chief, then each one will help the other. But Davis is in no mood to send cavalry from Mississippi to help Johnston until Johnston demonstrates that he's willing to do something with the forces he has in hand. And the sad thing here is I think the strategy that Johnston comes up with, whatever defects he may have had as a commander, is probably worth trying. It doesn't get tried because there's no cooperation, no sense of mutual trust between these two individuals. That is the result of this long, difficult political as well as strategic disagreement. Is that responsive? Yes, sir.
When Johnston went west the first time, and he was in essence a theater commander, it failed. Was it because of the job was too great, or was the man not up to the job?
That's, boy, I tell you, that's a good one. The easy answer to that, of course, is both. Johnston doesn't believe in the command structure. He complains against it when he gets the appointment. And again, professionally, his responsibility is to say, no, sir, I can't accept this job because you've defined a responsibility that I cannot accept fully. That, he claimed, would have been letting down the side, so to speak. So he accepts the job, but he never really has faith in it. What he wants is an Army command. He doesn't want to have this sort of vague, Halleck-like theater command where he tells the armies kind of how to move and coordinates reinforcements, but doesn't command personally in the field. He doesn't like that. That's one problem right away. The second problem, on the other side of the argument, is that I think Davis does misunderstand, underestimate is a better word. He underestimates the difficulty of making those transitions from the Army of Tennessee to the Army of Mississippi and back and forth. He visits once, comes and visits the Army at Murfreesboro, does an inspection, looks it over and says, it looks like it's in pretty good shape to me. I think you can send 10,000 men from this army to go help Vicksburg, Mississippi. And off they go by this circuitous rail system over this clickety-clackety rail system the South is trying to hold together. After they leave, of course, is exactly when the Battle of Stones River or Murfreesboro is fought, denying Bragg 10,000 men that might have made a difference in that drawn battle. And they don't get to Vicksburg really in time to have a dramatic impact on that campaign. Johnston looks at this and says, look at this. This shows why it won't work. You draw from this one, it gets beat, and this one gets beat before they get there. It's too big a theater. And it may derive from the fact that Davis and others were used to thinking in terms of the Virginia theater, although Davis was himself a Mississippian, where you could move from the valley to Richmond and back, as Jackson did in 1862 with great success, whereas the distances being so much greater in the West, those kinds of maneuvers were far more difficult. So the answer is both. I think Johnston didn't try hard enough to make it work, and I think Davis underestimated the difficulties or the friction inherent in that kind of command structure.
Other questions? Billy.
Had there not been the controversy of Patrick Claiborne writing a letter concerning using black suits, do you think that he was a possibility of him being commander of the Army?
Probably not. Probably not. It's conceivable he might have been made a corps commander. There are opportunities for Claiborne to be promoted to corps command, and curiously enough, the best possible opportunity is one where I think his advocacy of arming blacks to serve in the Confederate Army is not a factor. When John Bell Hood gets command of the Army after Johnston is dismissed by Davis in July of 1864, Hood then fleets up to Army command and needs a new corps commander for his own corps, and looks around at his division commanders and says, I don't think any of these guys could do the job. He goes to William J. Hardee, who was Claiborne's closest friend and mentor in the Army, and says to Hardee, which of your division commanders would be good to promote to corps command? And Hardee names Benjamin Cheatham, not Pat Claiborne. Hardee was one of the ones who was, one of the few, who was sympathetic with Claiborne's proposal to arm slaves. So that was not a factor in the recommendation that Hardee makes. I suspect there are two factors in Hardee's decision. One is he wants to keep Claiborne near him. You know, I want this guy fighting in my corps. But number two, I think he may have looked at Pat Claiborne and says, this is a hard-hitting, hard-fighting, dedicated division commander. But is he necessarily the more removed chess master necessary to command a corps? Or even, for that point, an army? Richard made a very good argument about Nathan Bedford Forrest this morning. I wouldn't put Claiborne quite in that category. Claiborne could, I think, command a division quite successfully. I think might have been an effective corps commander. I wonder if he would have been an effective Army commander. It's one of those, you know, what ifs. I mean, one of the reasons Claiborne has this huge mythology associated with him is that dying as he does at the moment of the Confederacy's greatest disaster in the Battle of Franklin, there's this what if. What if he hadn't died? What if he'd been given command instead of John Bell Hood? You know, how would history have been different? I don't think that was ever a serious possibility. He might have been made a corps commander and briefly held a corps commander at the Battle of Jonesboro. But I don't think he would have been made Army commander, even if he'd never said anything about Army slaves. But to find out, you should buy my book when it comes out in March. Yes, sir.
To what extent did the upcoming election of 1864 in New York have on the relationship, particularly with Johnston's army and Davis's political and military strategy around that point?
In what I've called elsewhere the Battle of the Books that takes place in the 1870s and into the 1880s between survivors who write self-justifying memoirs back and forth about why they were right and all their opponents were wrong, there's an awful lot of discussion. Well, you see, if Johnston had been retained in command and delayed the war, stretched it out, played out the game, rather than doing what Hood did and launch these assaults at Peachtree Creek, and particularly at the Battle of Atlanta, then perhaps the Confederacy could have held on to Atlanta through the fall, thereby affecting perhaps the outcome of the presidential election in 1864. McClellan would have been elected president on grounds that suggested he would have opened negotiations. The Confederacy survives the war, becomes an independent nation. That's the scenario. I think most of this is thought up afterward. I don't see any evidence in the contemporary letters back and forth that this was part of Johnston's strategy. In fact, I've argued elsewhere that this plan that's so closely associated with Johnston, that, well, I will give way trading space for time and extend Sherman's supply lines and then attack those supply lines. This is a plan he comes up with only after he's been forced out of Dalton. You know, he gets caught at Snake Creek Gap. There's no doubt about that. He's caught again at Resaca, and he moves. It's only when the battles around Dallas, New Hope Church, around in there, he looks at the casualty figures of his army and the estimated casualty figures of the enemy's army, which are inflated, and concludes that he may be winning this thing. And this is, in fact, what has been forced upon me is a good thing. And that's when he begins to make this argument to Jefferson Davis and elsewhere that, look, this is the way we want to conduct this, but we have to hit these supply lines to make it work. His credibility lost in his relationship with Davis. Davis did not support that notion. My argument is, whatever else you may say about Johnston, that's not a bad idea and certainly worth trying. But to go back to your initial question, no, I don't think that that is a well-considered factor, certainly not by Johnston, in advocating this particular plan in North Georgia. That's after the fact. He thinks of it. It's a way to justify what he did, so it appears to him.
Last question.
How did Davis